my name's Erin Hughes. I'm the curator at Contemporary Collaborations, and this is Josh Wright.
Hello.
And today we're going to be asking Josh a few questions about his current solo exhibition, NIMBY, with Contemporary Collaborations at Robert Young Antiques. For those that don't already know, Contemporary Collaborations is a project where we invite contemporary artists to select an object or several objects from the Robert Young Antique collection to be inspired by, to create an artwork or an installation to be displayed in the gallery window. For Josh's project, he selected a Prattware money box in the form of a little cottage, little ceramic piece. So Josh, what first attracted you to working with this object, and how did the history of this object inform the direction of your project, NIMBY?
Yeah, well, so when we first met, when I first came to Robert Young Antiques, I was in the process of doing a residency at Kettle's Yard. So outside of my sort of independent sculptural practice, I also have a practice with a close friend, Guillaume Van Dam. We work collaboratively, and we were there in Cambridge for a year. And Kettle's Yard, for those of you that don't know, is a home, is a domestic space. It is the home of Jim and Helen Eade, and it's a kind of exquisite collection of paintings of 20th century art by really, prominent names, but also furniture and natural objects. He was a big collector of shells, of pebbles. And what's really lovely about that is that he, everything was sort of displayed on an even playing field, and there's no hierarchy between the Brancusi in the corner and the pebble on the coffee table. And that was something that really struck me, and he always referred to the home as a sanctuary. And so kind of going in to Robert Young's, whilst having that experience, there are a lot of parallels between the two. I mean, obviously, Robert Young's is not a home, it's an antique shop, but certainly all of the things are designed to be, are for people's homes. But what's interesting is the way in which these very practical objects, such as oyster sticks that served a very, a purpose, have been elevated to kind of art objects and are very sculptural now. And just, Robert Young Antiques as a space is just so overwhelming. It's a real treasure trove of things. You kind of don't really know where to look. And then, so I was sort of struck by the beauty of this like very small, very delicate ceramic slip cast money box, which I think really, for me, I mean, besides it just being this very beautiful thing, spoke of universal ideals of home ownership, and this idea of kind of the quaint British cottage, which seems very far removed from my own existence living in London, and kind of far removed from where the piece now resides too, in Battersea, with all of the kind of urban regeneration around that area too.
The materials in your installation are very cohesive. I'm interested to hear more about how the Prattware money box informed these aesthetic choices. And can you also tell us a little bit about the making processes you used?
Yeah, well, I think, like with a lot of Robert's objects, the handmade, hand-painted quality of the ceramic money box was really the most important thing to me. It was, that was what I was drawn to. I mean, the object itself is a kind of mass reproduced ceramic object. It exists in many forms. It is possible to find more of these online, but what's unique is that each one is individually painted, different glazes, different outfits given to those two external figures on the outside. So that interested me, that they are all the same but different. And I can relate to that in my own work, in the sense of, I have a very handmade approach to making. And then really, I guess what interested me in the object was these ideals that I spoke of home ownership and all of that that represents. And so it felt important to talk about it in a present day context. And within that drew me to using contemporary materials. So using materials that you'd find in the new build developments, such as plasterboard, or thinking about bricks. A lot of my materials that I tend to use anyway are waste product, a byproduct of construction sites. I often kind of skip dive So, you know, and pulling out materials from construction sites. So that all kind of fed into my thinking, really. And then, so for instance, I have in the window, I have this kind of display of these like littered ersatz bricks that are precariously balanced on the structures and kind of litter the floor of the window space. And that in a way was a link for me to the power station. That certainly got me thinking about bricks as the structure itself is the largest brick structure in Europe, but also what this red brick kind of represents, which is something that feels very British and kind of has associations with kind of middle class British suburbia. And they are quite simply made with household insulation. So just, again, pieces that I've just kind of pulled out off the street or out of skips, and then cut up into these brick structures, and then they're quite simply painted with a jesmonite, which is like a kind of plaster, a strong kind of plaster resin. And then with the plasterboard, I was really interested, which fed into the book as well that I produced. But I was very interested in the language used to kind of package and market these developments. And I remembered a kind of transfer technique that I had been taught when I was like doing GCSEs or A-level at school, which was just using this sort of cellulose thinner, essentially. And what you can do is you can print like any standard inkjet or laserjet print, and then just by kind of rubbing the thinner on the back, it transfers whatever the image is or the text is onto any surface. So it was really beautiful because I was able to mimic the kind of printed texts that you get on plasterboard, but actually kind of use it in a more pointed and charged way to kind of think about this subject of housing and home ownership.
Can you tell us a bit about the title NIMBY, where you came across it?
Yes. So I think I first came across the acronym when I was watching the Jane Jacobs documentary. She was a very prolific activist, and was kind of, you know, incredibly important in preventing what was like the lower Manhattan Expressway in the 60s. And she's a prime example of a good NIMBYist. And she, you know, was able to prevent this expressway from happening, and it was which would have destroyed what is now, you know, present day Soho, Greenwich Village, and Tribeca. And that was very much pictured as a kind of David and Goliath story. And so that really interested me. But of course, NIMBY, perhaps in like a more modern day association, is as someone who is kind of against something because it inconveniences them, like they're against this housing going up because it spoils their view or destroys something that's, you know, just kind of seems a bit rudimentary, really. So I was quite interested in that duality between the two.
You began researching this project by spending time walking around and looking at Battersea, in particular the power station regeneration build, which you mentioned recently in your interview with Telling Art podcast, which incidentally was recorded on the 436 bus. Can you talk a bit about how this groundwork informed your project with CC and how it ties into your upcoming walk with Dazzle Club?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you touched upon the Telling Art podcast, and what was really interesting about that was just kind of this epiphany or this realization that there was a bus that connected me directly from my studio in Lewisham all the way past, you know, places I've lived in London, past where I studied, all the way to Battersea. And so that was a really nice thing. And then it was quite a fun challenge as well to record a podcast on a bus, back when riding a bus was, you know, a thing that one could do quite comfortably before COVID. But yeah, so that was really interesting. But also, Battersea is an area that I didn't actually know that well. I've spent like 7 years living in London, but had never particularly had much of a reason to go to Battersea. So it felt really important when I was working with Robert Young Antiques and thinking about Battersea and thinking about the site and the urban regeneration that's going on. I had to kind of experience it myself, and I had to spend as much time as I could there. So that was really great. And what was particularly nice as well, or interesting for me, was that it's such a constantly mutating and evolving space because of the construction and this pace at which the construction is happening. There's so many developments that are happening all along the river, from Nine Arms all the way along, including a big construction with the Royal College of Art just across from Robert Young IT. So there's so much change happening at any one time. So it was just quite interesting to be able to go back, and every time there would be something new. And then with the Dazzle Club, through doing all of this walking, through doing all this groundwork, it felt like it was a really interesting outlet to think about Battersea and to think about the space. We actually lead a walk through Battersea and in and around Battersea and showcase the construction, but also this quite visible divide between some like old parts of Battersea, the very affluent parts of Battersea, such as St Thomas's, where the Royal Children go to school, and some of these very deprived council estates that have incredibly high crime rates and are set to be demolished. There's a very visible divide in Battersea, perhaps more than anywhere else I've seen personally in London. And then with the Dazzle Club, they are a really interesting anti-surveillance collective, and what they do is currently they're inviting artists to lead walks in different areas of the UK. And they have developed this technique of painting. Well, it's not theirs. I can't remember who developed it, but they use this technique called dazzle paint, where they paint. It's like a form of reverse contouring. So they'll paint the face with face paint, kind of in the reverse of the way that a normal face would be. So I guess the areas that are darker, like the eye sockets, you'd paint lighter, and it's a way of preventing facial recognition from recognizing the face. So that was really interesting. And I'm close friends with Emily Roderick, who is part of that collective. There are 4 artists in that collective. And so it just came about really organically, and it seemed like a nice invitation to kind of work with them and to explore Battersea, and also consider surveillance within Battersea, which is particularly prominent around the power station, because the development is investing so heavily in advanced technologies of facial recognition. Apple are moving their headquarters there, so there's a lot of really interesting things specifically to surveillance as well that tie into Battersea.
Can you talk a bit about your publication NIMBY and how you came across the work of Loretta Lees?
With the publication, this opportunity and spending so much time in Battersea, it felt like a really prime time to produce what is essentially my first artist book. Of spending so much time there, it seemed like the perfect kind of outlet or vehicle to translate some of these thoughts and ideas. And then one thing that became more prominent through the book, and that fed into the window as well, was thinking about the power station, but also how the power station is sort of packaged and marketed, and the language that is used to kind of commodify and sell these units, and the way they sort of tap into the history of Battersea, and like there's certain kind of buzzwords that they use that really interested me, and also the way in which that they kind of avoid certain things. So gentrification as a word has such negative connotations. They would never ever use it, but there's a kind of a lot of repetition of the words of like renewal and redevelopment and regenerate, these kind of, I guess, rousing words that have certain associations with people that can create a sense of excitement or buzz. So that kind of really interested me. And then I, was honing in a lot, or thinking a lot about gentrification and the potential problems that a development such as the power station would have in terms of further gentrifying the area and displacing smaller businesses and kind of neighbouring communities. And it was through that I found out about Loretta Lees. I kind of stumbled upon what was essentially an anti-gentrification handbook called Staying Put, that she had published with residents from the Haygate estate in Elephant Castle, but also in collaboration with artist collective SNAG, the Southwark Notes Archive Group. So that was kind of where I first came across Loretta's work. But she's incredibly well recognized and well published around issues of displacement and gentrification. And so it seemed like the perfect opportunity to kind of approach her and try and have an interview. So that interview is, an incredible kind of insight into kind of her mind, her thinking about Battersea, but also thinking about housing more broadly across the whole of London, and also the implications that the pandemic and COVID-19 will have on housing, and the potential for people to kind of, potential people leaving London, I guess.
How did this collection of research influence your project, NIMBY, with contemporary collaborations?
Well, I think certainly the language fed into the work quite directly. I mean, I was really interested in how this transfer technique could be applied to the materials itself. So, because the plasterboard already comes kind of with this date or this date of manufacture, and so I quite liked the way I could kind of play with that and probe that in a way. And so some of these words that are featured in the publication, kind of buzzwords like energy efficient, or we talked about regeneration or renewal, these words are kind of banded across some of the structures or the precarious sculptures that I've made that are kind of these sort of broken sheets of plasterboard. And then also as well, the publication kind of gave rise to what essentially is a series of photographs that are very rooted in now, because they are kind of half-built constructions of, like Frank Gehry's kind of huge vanity project of apartments that are just behind the power station. The documents are very much rooted in now because it's half-built. So that was interesting too. And the photographs then also fed into the plasterboard. So I applied the same technique and was able to kind of transfer whole images onto the face of the plasterboard, which then kind of again littered the space, but also functioned as a kind of temporary plinth-like structure for the money box itself inside the antique shop.
How did you find working within the confines of the window space? Were there any aspects of the context of the window that fed into your thinking about your installation?
Yeah, I think the window display is a really interesting kind of mechanism. It's not something that I've particularly used to doing. And I think as a sculptor, I tend to think very three-dimensionally, obviously making sculpture that can be viewed from all angles. And as I'm making it from all angles. So I'm very conscious of how it is depicted in from any side really. So kind of the challenge of the window display in many ways is that it's one viewpoint, that of the kind of passerby. And I think also the nature of what I chose to do, which was a kind of installation of these precarious structures that are all balanced on each other, could have only really existed in real time. So rather than kind of finishing a product, an object, an artwork in the studio and taking it to a gallery space, it was more a case of actually really responding to the constraints of the window in real time. And a kind of nice challenge of that too was also having people pass by and engage and interact with the work, particularly whilst it was still being made, or still kind of being finished, because I think that's a very vulnerable position. You normally close the door to the studio and that's you, and you're in your bubble and you're kind of making things, and you kind of keep the world out until this is a kind of finished thing that you then showcase. And it's like, here, look at this thing that can kind of stand on its own. But it was actually really nice to be able to get kind of chat to people throughout that process and kind of just engage on a very sort of human basis, as it was still being made, which I really liked.
Great. Well, thanks for your generous answers, Josh. And to our audience, if you have any questions for Josh or myself, please DM us at Contemporary Collaborations and we'll get back to you. Thanks again to Josh for all the work you've done with NIMBY, for NIMBY. That's from me and also the Robert Young Antique team. And thanks for watching.
Great. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to be involved with this project.